For the council.
Thank you. Is this, John, is our microphone working? Perfect, thank you. So, kia ora, welcome back everybody. Just quickly before I pass over to Alan, I just wanted to touch on a couple of things. And I appreciate that our focus today is on Appendix 11. But I think it's useful just to remind everybody that the plan is more than just the allocation limit or the interim limit, and that this should not be seen in isolation. Sorry, is that better?
Yep, thank you.
Proposed Plan Change 9 provides a pathway to better management and understanding. For instance, Policy 33 recognises adverse effects. Policy 43 provides for a review of the limit. And the rules are not aimed at meeting the interim limit, but introduce new limits for consent applicants that will have a real impact on limiting how much can be abstracted, unlike our current consents, and severely constrain or even potentially prohibit new abstraction. And it's worthwhile just pointing out that there are a number of points that have been raised today which sit outside the scope of Appendix 11, and we do not propose to discuss these again, as we feel that they've been fully addressed in our closing statement from week 3 and also in our reports. And if you'll allow me, I will pass over to Alan. Oh, you've got one. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Evans.
Is that on? Is that on? Oh, yes. Tēnā koutou katoa. So I will briefly just step through the memos provided to the panel on Friday in response to Minute 10. So the first memo responded to the concerns raised by Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Incorporated and Te Tai Whenua Uhiritanga in relation to the water quantity provisions. In the memo, I responded to the 4 main aspects raised by the evidence and further submissions and explain why those revisions were made. For the other concerns raised, I refer to where I had previously, or where other members of the reporting team had previously responded to those concerns, and I did not recommend that the panel made further changes to PPC 9. If there were any other aspects of those submissions that the panel wanted to know where we had previously responded to them from, I'm happy to take questions and provide further direction on that. The second memo responds to the 6 specific questions raised by the panel. The memo shows that somewhere in the order of 165 million cubic metres is allocated from that Hiritonga aquifer on paper. However, actual use is estimated to be about 90 million cubic metres, so that demonstrates that there is an on-paper over-allocation. Modelling has shown that the current level of use will not cause adverse effects to increase. However, if we allow use to increase, the modelling shows that adverse effects will also increase. That's why it's so important that we halt water use levels where they are now. Proposed PPC 9 does this by only allocating actual and reasonable use to existing users. This approach also allocates water to the agreed reliability of supply. PPC 9 does not use an average because most years the climate is not average. Looking at water use in the 2012-2013 water year is a proxy for understanding water demand required to meet a 95% reliability of supply. If there is a wetter year, consent holders will not use their full allocation. If there is a drier year, consent holders may use their full allocation and then be required to stop pumping. Consent holders will have to learn to use their allocation very carefully in the dry years. The interim limit does not function the way a normal allocation limit does. Its purpose is not to set an amount that is divided between X number of users. Rather, it is an estimated benchmark against which Council can begin to gather more information and can help interpret data arising from completing the reallocation process. Once we can put a number with greater confidence to what actual and reasonable use is, it will give us a starting point for future conversations about management of adverse effects. Myself and the rest of the tank reporting team are available to answer any questions you have about any aspect of the plan change. Thanks.
Ellen, those 2013 figures, have you taken into account the the growth that Hawke's Bay's gone through since then? That's sort of, 8 years old, those figures?
Yes, and I think that's something that redoing the current consent on paper allocation showed, is that since 2017, which is when it became apparent that there was an issue with over-allocation, the council has not been granting new resource consents for water takes. And I think the fact that the estimated water allocation is still in the same ballpark as it was when that calculation was first done back in 2017 shows that the water allocations haven't been increasing since.
Thank you. Did you have any question?
Yeah, I just want to pick up on the point made earlier on about this application not just being about allocation and limitations, that sort of stuff. And whether, I suppose the first question I have is, do you think we've covered everything that we need to cover in addition to the allocation issue that's, I guess, at the core of the application? But I mean, one of them, of course, is the sort of mātauranga tikanga parts of the bigger picture. And it's a bigger picture thing that I'm really sort of querying mainly.
Yeah, I think PPC 9 has always been about managing the effects. And so, although a lot of the discussion today has been about where an allocation limit should be set, that conversation doesn't take into account the rest of the plan provisions which talk about mitigating the adverse effects. And although we have heard that mitigation isn't enough, and the submitters who have spoken today seek the avoidance of adverse effects, we've received evidence from, for example, Pavel Rakowski. His evidence showed that to eliminate all adverse effects would essentially require everybody to stop taking water. And that's not sustainable for anyone in Hawke's Bay. It would require, the urban centres to also stop taking water. So talking about the mitigations is actually a really essential part of the plan change, and looking at the whole plan change together.
Yeah.
Kerry, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's all I have. Thank you. Yeah.
So, Alan, excuse me. There are a large number of consents that have expired and are now being continued under section 124. Given that this plan change might take a while to get through the various processes, would it be the council's intention to review those expired consents regardless of where this plan change sits in terms of appeals and so forth?
My understanding is that yes, under the RMA, proposed plan provisions that relate to water have to be taken account of as of notification. The reason the council hasn't been doing that is to avoid a situation where essentially the plan is relitigated on a consent by consent basis, where individual consents are looking at their individual effects rather than looking at the big picture and looking at the cumulative effects together.
So if I remember correctly, excuse me, the rules come into effect as soon as the plan is notified, correct?
Yes.
But the consenting is relying on objectives and policies in the plan, isn't it?
Yes.
So the rules alone being in effect doesn't give you a consenting pathway, a generic consenting pathway, if you like, for those expired consents.
I don't quite know what you mean by that.
By a generic consenting pathway, I mean an agreed a way of, how can I put it? It's a good question as to what I exactly meant.
I'm glad I asked that.
What I mean is there's no policy pathway, if you like, established at the moment that would give a way of granting those consents within a consistent framework, because it relies on the objectives and policies in proposed Plan Change 9.
To an extent, but the rules in themselves also contain conditions that, although they are giving effect to the policies, I guess they can stand on their own for now. But perhaps a council might have a more legal opinion on that. But I'm just trying to remember off the top of my head the exact wording of, for example, rules 9 and 10, but they refer to reallocating actual and reasonable use. And so I guess that on its own stands and would be, for a consent being reallocated, it would be reallocated the actual and reasonable use.
So the Regional Resource Management Plan, as it is at the moment, doesn't provide a fallback position?
The Regional Resource Management Plan itself doesn't, but it is in the context of the Regional Policy Statement. PPC 9 doesn't propose to change the RPS.
No.
And, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps I might reword the question in this way. Can you remind us again what was going to be the process for addressing those expired consents?
I think the dates are scheduled, are set out in Schedule 33
Yes, that's right.
and Policy 38. So to be within 10 years of the plan being made operative, or upon expiry of the consent, whichever is sooner.
Okay.
Yes, I wonder if it's just helpful in terms of the objectives and policies in the proposed plan, although there's a different process in terms of legal effect and not, a council processing consent applications obviously still does need to take into account all provisions of a proposed plan as well. So it's a matter of weight as you go through that process as to how much reliance you can put on those objectives and policies in the proposed plan when it comes to consenting.
So just to follow up, Alan, are there some of the consents, I assume some of the consents that have expired would, the volumes that have actually been allocated to them would be about what they would get in the actual and reasonable test, or would that be an unusual case?
I can't comment on that with any great certainty, but as we heard in the earlier weeks of the hearing, some submitters are using only 50% of their allocation and they're quite big operators, and other people have not had the chance of using much water, whereas there are some people who could be using 80 or 90% of their allocation, and that's why doing the reallocation process is so important to actually figure out how much is really being used. And that's also why a simple pro rata reduction isn't really a suitable option, because you would be unfairly taking water off somebody who's actually using it, whereas someone else could say, yep, I'll happily sacrifice 15%, I'm not even using 15%. So,
Thank you.
If you can go to policy 37, tank 37, in the last update to draft plan, I just wanted to confirm. So part A of that is it says adopt an interim allocation limit 90 million cubic metres per year based on actual and reasonable use. And it says prior to 2017 has been struck out. My understanding, and I've had a quick search through the draft, is that that's the only reference in the draft to 90 million cubic metres. Is that your understanding?
yes, I think that's correct.
And if we go to the glossary and the definition, revised definition of actual and reasonable, it says that under B, the maximum amount as measured by accurate water meter data in 10 years preceding to 2nd of May 2020. and I was just trying to reconcile that with the wording in the policy 37. There is no reference to a year or a period of time for the actual and reasonable test.
Yeah, so the reason that I deleted prior to 2017 from poll tank 37 is because seeing as the plan was notified as at the 2nd of May 2020, and from the work that Rob Waldron did looking at actual estimated use over those additional years, it was appropriate to include actual and reasonable use looking from the 10 years preceding 2020 rather than 2017. So I removed the reference to 2017 from the policy to improve consistency with the definition.
Okay. What I'm wondering is, and we've been fixated on 90 million cubic metres quite a bit, particularly me. What does it need to be in there in the policy? Does 90 million cubic metres need to be in there if the definition for actual and reasonable just specifies a maximum over a 10-year period of time, which might happen to be 2012, 2013?
Yeah. I guess the short answer is no, but as we heard from the submitters this morning, that was sought through and agreed to by the Regional Planning Committee before notification.
So that it's in there because of that decision that was made. Okay. So it's your opinion that it should stay in there?
Yeah. Yep.
Turning to the second memo that was dated 24 September, the response to the panel's questions, and the second to last paragraph before question 6 on page 5, the last sentence of that paragraph says, therefore, in my opinion, the abstraction calculated for 2012-13 might be overestimated by up to 10%, but is unlikely to be an underestimate. Is that a big deal? I mean, that's I don't know, 9 million cubic metres.
Jeff, would you like to respond to this one?
Yep. So, seeking to answer the question, I got the sense that it was really the panel were wanting to be informed by some sort of confidence or uncertainty bounds around that estimate, and so that's 10% difference I'd expect to be really out on the limb in terms of being an underestimate. An overestimate. And that's just based on comparing it to the 2019-20 climate. So it's kind of arm waving a little bit. It's not a rigorous uncertainty analysis, but what I'm trying to say there is it's really unlikely that we've underestimated that amount. And in terms of it being a big deal, in terms of the policy framework, based on the discussion you just had with Alan, I'm not sure it is, but it's a policy question.
Right, well, I guess it might be a big deal to some people.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
suppose on the face of it, 90 versus 81, that's the basic mass of it. That seems like quite a big deal. That's almost halfway to the 70 million, that number of the submitters. So, yeah, I suppose it's, again, we're asking for the confidence or the just understanding more the uncertainty of that.
Yeah, so we have absolute confidence in the, high confidence, in the municipal public water supply and industrial takes. It's the irrigation takes where we didn't have meters on all of them. 60 to 70% of the volume was metered at the time. So as we get closer and closer to 2017, we've got more and more confidence because there's more metered data going in to inform that. So 2013-14, to be honest, in my opinion, I'd be surprised if it was more than 5% out, but 10% would be the extreme. And in terms of it being a policy response, that was, of course, the question of how relevant is this in the plan, whether it's 90 or 70.
Sorry if I could clarify the answer before about whether the number should be in or not. I think that depends on what role you're expecting the number to play. If you're expecting it to be a hard limit that allocation stops once we've reached it, or that it's a target for increasing allocation up to that number, that's not how it should be interpreted.
Okay.
It should be interpreted
It's
as a...
the line of other questions, yeah.
Isn't there an additional complicating factor in that actual and reasonable for some people will be the 2012-13 water year, for other people it'll be the 1920 water year because they will have used more water in one year or the other. So is that likely to be a somewhat confounding or complicating factor?
Potentially, yeah, I'd agree that there may be cases where the choice of years will add more allocation in there, but I haven't quantified it, so I'm really sorry I can't answer that right now.
Is there any way of estimating how much that might be in round figures, or is that too hard an ask?
Yeah, it's too hard of an ask now. I did actually, our consents team and our data collection team, when they were doing the rerunning the numbers of consented volumes, I did ask if they were able to run an analysis similar to that, but at the moment our the data isn't set up, and they're building a water allocation calculator at the moment that will be capable of that sort of analysis, but it's not available right now.
So the simple answer is that so it's not a simple answer. So if the 2012-13 is an overestimate, and it seems quite possible that it is, then there might be a counterbalancing factor that some people will then rely on the 1920 year as their actual and reasonable use, and that could be more than was in 12-13.
Yeah, and then that's where policy 42 becomes important, because then it provides a benchmark of saying we thought it was about 90 actual and reasonable use, or that the effects that were modelled, we thought the use was about 90, and that provides us a point to start looking at, well, we have actually ended up allocating 87 million cubic metres or 91 million cubic metres. How does that change what we thought we knew?
I assume that the 90 million cubic metres doesn't include the permitted activities, that they're over and above that. It's not intended to include those in the 90 million?
I think in the modelling that Rob did, it did include permitted activities, and it was around 91 million cubic metres for including unconsented use. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct, and the groundwater modelling that was done as well included the permitted activities in there.
Can I just go to the graphs on page 6 of the response, please? So the sites chosen, are those representative of a number of wells around the Hiratonga Plains? Is that why they're...
Yes, although this is a subset of what was actually reported in the groundwater modelling report. They were chosen for longevity of record and to be roughly representative. Most of them are state of the environment monitoring wells.
And so presumably they were also chosen because they cover the area, the whole area, and not just selected parts of the aquifer.
Yeah, and we try to get a few in there that are deeper rather than just the shallow ones as well. So yeah, there were some deeper wells in there. As I said, that's a subset of what was in the report, which again is a subset of the calibration wells that we used to calibrate the model. These ones, I think I selected these because they less ambiguity in the results, just trying to show the general nature of that repeating of the 90 million cubic metres year on year.
I wasn't clear from this where, like, the green line is the model simulations, and I wasn't clear from that. It did say that groundwater levels would remain depressed. I'm not using the right words, and surface water flows would remain low. But under that scenario, could the Naroro drop as much as is in the blue line, or would it stay at a higher level? Sorry, let me put it another way. To what extent would it flows in the Naroro be affected by the green line simulation, the model simulation?
Yeah, so I think what these graphs show is when you're looking at groundwater levels, the green line is sitting right at the bottom of the seasonal variation of groundwater levels. And you might wonder why there's not a more of a decline. And I think the answer is in that Ngātaroto plot, where the green line shows that if you have repeated dry years year after year, it's inducing more recharge from the Ngātaroto into the groundwater system. So probably the greatest effect, I'd say, would have been on the Ngātaroto river flows in that case. And I'll just point out that the purpose of that green line is because we were trying to give some indication of what we might expect under climate change scenarios. And we weren't happy with the projections that we have based on the global climate models. They're quite uncertain, and especially in the near term out to 2050. So we chose this extreme example. Imagine if 2012-13 was repeated year after year after year. That's the absolute worst case we'd expect under a climate change scenario. So somewhere in between the red and the blue line is what we'd expect. Sorry, the red and the green line.
What would be the consequences of our changing that number to, say, 85 million in real terms? Do you know?
In terms of the interim limit to 85 million, again, it comes down to the interpretation where it's intended to be, as I said, used for a benchmarking in Policy 42. But if people were to try and hold it as a hard limit, then yeah, I don't really know what would happen, but I can imagine it would be trying to force council to stop allocating water to existing users, I guess.
So would a more appropriate approach to say the amount will be X million, or the total allocated via the actual and reasonable test, whichever is the least or more, if you like. Say we set it at 85, or say we set it at 90, and then said if the actual and reasonable test comes up with a number less than that, then that will be the limit. Or if we set it at 85 and then said if the actual and reasonable test is higher than that, then that shall be the limit.
No, not necessarily, because I think that loses sight of the effects, and it also loses sight of the potential for the community to actually want to set a more stringent level at a later date to, you know, or maybe the community may want to set a less stringent limit, but with other mitigations or other tools to manage the water. I think it creates quite a binary and linear management process, which I guess depends on your ethos to river manage or resource management, but I think it unnecessarily limits the community's options going forward.
Or alternatively, we could set it at a lower number and then leave a bit for new activities, couldn't we?
The risk in that is, as I've discussed before, is that the modelling shows that existing use will leave the levels where they are, but an increase in use is expected to increase the adverse effects.
Well, if it was only a small number, that wouldn't necessarily apply.
Yeah, and this is the issue I had coming up with the policy advice around the non-complying status, which you requested at the closing, is how to limit it to only a small number becomes very difficult very quickly, because everybody wants access to water. As Roru mentioned earlier, water is the new gold, and it becomes a very, very difficult and very political job to do that very quickly.
I'm not entirely sure of that, but we'll have a chat about it and we might come back to you. I think there's some opportunities there with some very restrictive criteria like trickle irrigation only and those sort of things. And I'm conscious of things like people might want a little more water for a short term for crop establishment, for 2 or 3 years, in those sort of temporary situations. And I'm also conscious, I guess, of companies like Leaderbrand who could provide enormous opportunities in Hawke's Bay for relatively little water cost.
I guess that's where another tool that's in the plan that hasn't been discussed very much is the global consents. So there is the ability for consent holders to work together to use their consent smarter, and perhaps that could lead to a bit of consent sharing. So where I have established crops and you have new crops, there could be some sharing within those global consents.
As happens in Twyford Water,
Yes.
on a
yeah.
smaller scale, if you like.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See if we've got any more questions. Do you have more questions? Do you have more questions? No, we didn't have any further questions. Thank you very much.
I've got one more.
Oh, sorry.
Jeff, can you just explain very briefly, I know land surface recharge is a difficult issue in determining how much occurs. Can you just describe very briefly how land surface recharge was estimated as part of the model development, please?
Yeah, it was based on the Ecolink modelling where they modelled the irrigation demand. So they went a step further and also modelled how much rainfall would be expected to drain into the groundwater system, and that's our land surface recharge. It was also calculated independently by the source modellers using a similar but different water budget type model, and the numbers were really similar, which gave us confidence.
So I think some issue was taken this morning that once upon a time it was estimated to be 5 million cubes a year, which would be a pretty rough and ready calculation, and now it's 78.5. Is that, to what extent is that number reliable? Is it plus or minus 10%? Is it plus or minus 5%? Is it impossible to say? Or is it simply the best method available?
Yeah, I'd regard it as the best method available, but I think that the two independent models corroborating each other gave us confidence. And as for the old estimate of 5, I can't comment on that, sorry, but sometimes LSR is calculated as a percentage of rainfall, which is really rudimentary. This is, it was an expensive process for us to engage a modeller to identify it for us.
And that's only over the unconfined aquifer.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So you're confident that the confined aquifer is fully confined in effect?
In as much as there might be a tiny amount getting through there, but yeah, for modelling purposes, we're treating it as totally confined.
That's all the questions I've got. You didn't have any further questions, thank you. Edmund, was there any further comments that the team wanted to make?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Just in terms of things that were raised this morning, there was the email in regards to the FMUs that we'd received from the regional council. So I couldn't remember exactly that email, but it was a couple of sentences long. So Maggie sent it through to me, and it's so I have that, and we'll put that up on the website very shortly. It was just a response from the council just letting know that the FMU process very unlikely to be completed within the deliberations or the timing of this hearing. So I'll put that up as a matter of course. And we also had Ms. Wilson was going to go away and prepare us a list of those, perhaps some bullet points of those areas in which perhaps some planning caucusing could occur that she thought might be helpful and fruitful. That was all the matters we had arising from today, and I'm looking at my fellow commissioners. No raised eyebrows. That's good. And if there isn't anything further from the council, we'll look at starting our field. Now, this is I'm just going to take off my mask for a little bit. I feel like I'm a knight in a suit of armour, and I'm trying to talk through it. This may be the last time that we are together in a hearing, and I say maybe because for our deliberations there might be matters that we think that are important that we might end up back in hearing. But if this is certainly the last time we're in a formal hearing space, I'd take the opportunity again to thank all of our submitters from Tangata Whenua and from the community who've come along to our 4 lots of hearings. It seems like a little while now. I think with having this space, it seems like it's been a little while we've been in the Hawke's Bay. We've certainly enjoyed coming here every time. We've been well looked after, not only at the marae and in the venues that we've had our hearings, but also Maggie and Nicola have made sure that we stay in, I thought, good accommodation, and all of our needs have been taken care of, which has been really lovely, especially when we spend time away from family. So I'd also like to acknowledge our PANA members who live in various parts of the country, except Auckland and Northland, who've taken the time out from their families and other things that they do to come along and be part of this hearing. This completes only part of our task. This perhaps is the easy part, and the fun part is actually listening to all the submitters and asking questions. Now we will be going and deliberating and reviewing all of the evidence that we've had provided to us by the council, by Tangata Whenua, the community and others, and that's a task that we'll take very seriously. In terms of when a decision will be made, we'll probably give an indication once we're going to start our deliberations in the next few days, just to get a handle on some of the timeframes. So we'd probably like to be in a position to indicate to the parties in terms of when we think a decision might be forthcoming, dependent on whether we come back to have hearings and things. But we've got enough information that we can probably get on with things in any case. Is there anything else I needed to do?
Thanking the staff.
Oh, yes. As well as thanking Nicola and Maggie, which we've done, I think, after each hearing, because this is Maggie's very first lot of hearings, so this is thrown in the deep end. Normally, new staff get put on a consent hearing, which is 1 day, and then the decision's made the next week. But this is trial by fire, and I'd like to thank you, Maggie and Nicola, for your help, and also to the staff. I know it hasn't been easy. It's been a lot of hearings, a lot of technical information to get through, and you've been very responsive. So thank you, certainly through Ms. Edmonds and the team. Thank you very much for all of your helpfulness in this regard.
And I'd like to thank you particularly for thinking about things as we've gone through the process, and in particular the right of reply. The solutions to appendixes 30 and 31 or 29 and 30 are particularly appreciated because I think we would have really struggled with what to do with those. But also a lot of the response to submitters I think has been very helpful and very thoughtful through the process, and it hasn't been a matter of doggedly sticking to what we had, and that I think has been immensely helpful from our perspective. So thank you all for that. And thank you, Matt, for your legal advice, which is always succinct and to the point and very well expressed. Thank you.
Ia no, he tukuna te rākeo kia koe, e rauiwi tukuna ngā mihi poroporo ake kia rātou.
E rau. Oh. E mahi tātāua I mua I tōtū. Tai ho māku te tei koro I mua I awa. Just to give you a little bit of time, if you have the Te Kupinga app, I'm going to ask you to go to the Waiata section and look up Whakaaria mai, because later on it's going to be our Waiata. There'll be no excuses in terms of finding the kupinga. Earlier on, and thank you, Chair, I sought your indulgence and permission to be able to, in advance, tau nei tū, e rau, was to actually make a presentation.
Oh, yes, yes.
Kia ora. And I'd ask Maggie if you're able to pass.
No, we're all set.
Oh,
Maybe we jumped the gun, we're all ready to go.
Koena tētahi ngā take e te tua kia hau.
oh well. Just to let everybody else in the picture there, therefore. One of the great things that we exercise in terms of being hosts is to recognise as part of reciprocity. And there have been 2 occasions where our hosts have been through Māori and also through Chad. And I'm talking about Toi Toi and I'm talking about East Pier. Nā te mana whenua e manaku mai tēnei kaupapa e tō I tōna hae. Hoi anō, this part here has been, because of the gift, te tohu aroha nei, on the front of the page there, e tino tipu anō noro te rai atu hoi tēnā. Koe rā tāku e whakaaro ana. So I thought because of the portrait that is on the front of the gift to be given, and also tau nei timatatanga kōrero I te autane, e rā. And because of the reference to Tūhoi this morning, I thought it most appropriate that the gift be passed mai a mā tātua ki tēnei o tā kitina. Kia tuatu ki a koe rā.
A kāti rā tēnā no tātou. I ranga I raro I te mōhiotanga ke te haere tunu ngā mihi. Nei tātou ko tai ki tēnei wahanga o te hui, te otinga, rā mō tēnei wahanga. Hei rā, ko tahi tonu te kōrero ki a tātou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. E tika tāu mo te tohu tā koutou I whakaaro ake mōna. Te tangata nei, he tino hoa nāku. I mahi tahi māua, mai ngā tau ki muri, taira wā atu ki tōna utungāke. Reira, e koanga ngā kau tēnei, ko mai kiau, hei what. Reira, o te atu ngā mihi ki a tātou katoa. I was asked to give this gift to Mare. And I'll tell you right now, it's a book. And it's a book on whose cover is a very dear friend of mine. A guy I worked with, a guy who almost ended up marrying me and my wife, not marrying me. He had a large hand in my wife and I coming together and eventually marrying. So, yeah, he's a dear, dear, dear friend. He passed away a few years ago now. But perhaps more poignant is the title of the book. The title of the book is Te Kai a Te Rangatira. In English, that means the food of the chiefly. And in brackets, you don't see this, but in brackets is talk. Right? The food of chiefs is talk. It's a very well-known adage that every iwi knows. You stand with kai te rangatira, he kōrero. So on that basis, I think it's actually quite appropriate that we're giving it here in this surroundings, because I reckon most of us here probably think we're pretty good at talking. It's what we do, all right? So that's part of the reason why I'm delighted to be able to pass over this little tohu to Mare. Well, it's not little, it's actually quite big. But as I give it to him, I want to show you the cover. I got 2 copies of this for Christmas. That's the book there.
Yeah.
You can all see. And the gentleman on the cover is a fellow by the name of Wharehuia Milroy, Professor Wharehuia Milroy, who died about a year ago. Yeah, a year or so ago. Yeah. Very, very learned tūhoi gentleman, extremely. Probably one of the most learned people in the country, and on the sorts of, I mean, he knew everything about tikanga and whakapapa and that sort of thing. He was a leading light. So I suppose giving it to Mare might give him the false impression that he can just jump up there alongside this guy and be regarded as a...
Hey,
Yeah.
hey,
Anyway.
we let her.
E tohu aroha.
Ngā
Nā
pei.
mātou katoa.
Ngā mātou
Nā
katoa.
mātou.
O tēnā koutou, o tēnā tātou.
Oh, hang on, there's a card that goes with it.
Hui. Hey,
There's no money in it though.
kia ora. No money in it, eh? Oh, well, he whakaro noi hoi pāname ki tēnei tuku. Aroha tuku manaaki pāname ki ngā mahi i rau i te rāta marama. Hoi anō te mananga. Ko te tino tohu o te iwi o Ngāti Kahungunu, te manaaki o te tangata nei. So that's, you know, when we travel around the country and we see, particularly on the opposite side of Tika Maui, amongst our Taranaki and Wanganui people, you know, ko au te awa ko te awa ko au, makes a very important signature about the attitude and behaviour of the iwi. I just want to leave us with, it's a beautiful tohu, ātāhua, and me ki tēnei tangata, well known, well versed. He married my auntie actually, and so thank you very much in recognition of that particular time back. Me toi toi Pieri, and of course the invitation from our girl over here, Scary, to come in. And you may recall at that particular time Robert McDonald had passed away. And I think, you know, during times of restrictions and COVID, there comes a particular aspect about our tikanga. You know, have whati te tikanga when things that we've done traditionally change, that restrictions fall upon us, then we've got to find kimia here, you know, to me ngaro, search for a new tikanga. So on that particular day, I had shot out to Robert McDonald's tangihana and I started off with a karakia, you know, te timata o te wiki nei. And of course I disappeared for the first 2 days, day and a half. I turned up at the next session the following morning, and of course, you know, good thing about having another good whakatauki, bring that manaaki of ourselves together, join us at the hips, if at all possible, is of course the kanohi ki te kanohi. And so, of course, we took it upon ourselves that the karakia was that sort of powerful. Oh, give me the credit, thank you. And so far as having to start, at the start of the week, it was taken upon it that it lasted and rippled and with all the energy towards Friday afternoon. And so, tēnei te mihi atu. Tēnei te mihi tēnō aroha, mai ki a koutou. I'm sure we're going to share this around the crew because it also represents the kaha, you know, the energy, and amongst us some of the vitality, if you can look for it. So kia ora tātou, and as you're about to, we're about to finish with whakaria mai. This is just my parting mihi on behalf of Ngāti Kahungunu whānui. ko koutou mai, ko koutou ngā kaiwhakawā, ngā kumihana, mā te atu e te aki koutou rā i hoki ki te taha rātou nei whānau, e roti te taurangi Māori. Hoi anō, tēnei te mihi atu mai ko koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou, kia ora mai tātou katoa. Hoi anō te, hoi atu te rākau.
Parahi tēnei taha.
E am whakaari au mai. Engari, e mua rai te waita. Just practice in your minds, eh? So when it comes to sort of singing the himele, whakaari au mai, e ke kaha hukuta. E tū tēnei. E tū tēnei ki te mihi ki o koutou i te rōpū whakawa. E ua anō mai rā ki te matau a Māori. E whakarangatira hia i tēnei kaupapa, e hara nei te kaupapa ko te tangata, ko te kaupapa ko te pūtaia. Me ona toto e rere atu, e rere mai. Koina te kaupapa e whai nei a tātou katoa. He mea kia herea mai rai a tātou tēnā kaupapa. Hoi anō te mihi atu. Tēnā koutou, no rota rai mā tātu. E noho tahi mai rā ki tēnei, mai a tamatea. E herea mai rā tēnei, no rota rai raukawa, Ngātirangi. Me ki rā i ēnei, mai kai rota ki tēnā whenua, e tata rei te noto, a tāmaki. Engari ko tāku e mihi rā ki o koutou. Kāre anua i oti o koutou kaupapa. Kei te haere tonu. Ke aro matawai ke te tiro hea mai rā ki ēnei ngā kōrero i whāreki hia i muarai i o koutou aroara. Nō reira kia kaha, kia maia, kia mana wanui. Ko tāku huri mai rā ki tēnei ngā waka e kotahina i a tātou. Koutou rā e tono a mai ki tēnei te aroaro. Koutou e kawe a mai ngā kōrero mai rānu e pāna ki te wai. Tēnei te mihi ki o koutou o te tai whenua o Ngāti Kahungunu e haria mai ke tautuko mai i tēnā ngā tumanako mai rāna o te tātou nei mātua tipuna tēnā koutou katoa. Tai hoki rā ki tēnei whare. Anei rā tētahi o ngā kōrero i mua rā tā koutou hokinga. Mai i tēnei pito ki tērā atu o ngā pito. Aha ko te pito iwhia. Ko tēnei tāku nei e mihi rā kia tātāu. Kia hore te marino, kia whakapapa paunamu te moana, kia tere te kā rohi, kai mua rā i o koutou haere. Haere i te tika, haere i te pono. Ko tāu nei hoa haere ko te rangi Māori. A saying that's attributed back to a tipuna called Oranga Whenua. Kura tōna mea atu, kia tāwhiao. Ai te tau ko tahi mano waru rau, waru te kau mawha. Ai, kai tōna taumata, katahika mea mai Oranga Whenua. E tama haere. Kai runga ki ēnei o atu nei whakaro mō. Tāu nei haere atu ki Ingarangi ki te kuini i reira, haere Māori atu hoki Māori mai. Koera tōna ki atu, e kōrero nei kia tātou. And it was translated, those words of Oranga Whenua to Tāwhiao in 1884, it was translated as, may the calm be widespread, and may the pathways in front of you shimmer and glisten like that of greenstone, and may you speed quickly, swiftly to your point of destination, and may your constant companion be peace and goodwill to all whom you encounter. Koera tā koe mihi rā kia tātou katoa, mai i tēnei pito ki tērā pito. Pakaria mai. Kia tātātai.
Pakaria mai, turi peka ki au, ki aho mai, ka roto i te po, e kona Pakaria mai,
katoa te ata whai i o tātou riki o Ikuraiti. Me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahi taka ki te wairua tapu. Ake, ake, ake. Amen. Kia ora tata.
Kia ora.
And this must belong to someone.